Accused of corrupting the youth, Socrates defended himself before the Athenian court. In his defense speech, he spoke of the many young men in Athens who are full of talent and potential, but lack the most important gift of all, the wisdom to know how to use their abilities. Far from leading them astray, Socrates argued, he sought to guide them in their reflecting on their own lives, values, behaviors, and goals. Among the many people Socrates met was Alcibiades, a promising young man who was toying with the decision to enter politics and govern Athens. Socrates recognized that, despite the city's power, Alcibiades faced significant challenges. The Persians possessed greater wealth, and the Spartans benefited from a more rigorous education. How, then, could an Athenian hope to overcome these disadvantages? Socrates' answer was that Alcibiades first needs to learn to govern himself. The initial step in self-governance, he explained, is self-knowledge. Those who reflect on their own reason are able to distinguish truth from falsehood and good from evil. For Socrates, this reflective practice constitutes the foundation of wisdom and the key to managing one's own life, and only those capable of self-governance are prepared to govern others. Plato's dialogue, Alcibiades, Foucault argued, offers the first philosophical elaboration of the imperative, you must concern yourself with yourself. You can learn how to take care of your shoes, because there is an art to it, and a doctor can show you how to take care of your body. But who, Socrates asked, can teach you how to govern yourself? Neoplatonists regarded the Alcibiades dialogue as the first text any young man drawn to philosophy should read. Yet the roots of the philosophical concept of self-care can be traced back to pre-Socratic philosophy. The history of self-care that I present here is a summary of Michel Foucault's lectures from 1981 entitled Hermeneutics of the Subject. The philosophy of the pre-Socratics was deeply concerned with the question of how to live. The art of existence they developed revolved around the question of the self, the polis, the gods, nature, and the community. The practices they taught included purification rites, soul concentration, tests of conscience, temporary retreat from the world, and various trials in which one had to resist temptations. They were probably inspired by even older shamanistic techniques, such as the detachment of the soul from the body in meditation or special breathing techniques. With Plato and other post-Socratic philosophers, the art of existence became increasingly important and focused on one particular aspect, the self. The concept of self-care gained more and more prominence and reached its peak in the 1st and 2nd centuries when a genuine culture of the self emerged in the Roman Empire. In Plato's dialogues, self-care was mainly intended as a practice for young men who were at a crossroads in their lives and suffered from a lack of education. It was a means to the end of learning to rule over others. This focus dissolved over the centuries. Self-care ceased to be merely the initiation of a youngster and became a lifelong and permanent task. Some Roman philosophers even regarded old age as the ideal time to work on oneself. The focus shifted from a pedagogical model to a medical model. One must become a doctor of oneself and permanently take care of oneself. This led to heightened attention to everyday conduct, sometimes extending down to the smallest details of daily life. Self-care was no longer a means to an end. The self was now the highest end. The ability to govern others, while still related, was seen more as a natural byproduct of self-government. The self-reflections of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, for example, are not primarily about how to become a better emperor, but how to concern yourself with yourself, whether you are an emperor or a shoemaker. Other changes involved the abandonment of the erotic aspects that were still evident in Socrates' teachings and the abandonment of gymnastic exercises, which were still part of the curriculum in Plato's academy. Nonetheless, the 1st and 2nd centuries in the Roman Empire were a golden age of self-care, and the practices became more institutionalized. Various philosophical schools flourished during this time, such as the Stoics, the Epicureans, the Neoplatonists, the Cynics, the Therapeutae, and many more. In addition to these schools, most wealthy Romans had personal advisors who were also philosophers and offered guidance on everything from political matters to private affairs. They could help you with matters of life like, should I get married? Should I get involved in politics? Should I campaign for more democracy or for emperorship? Just how widespread and deeply rooted these practices and schools were is also shown by the many Roman satires on philosophers who helped people to look after themselves for a not so small fee. Roman-Hellenic self-culture grew to impressive proportions. Foucault made some suggestions of what an elaborate self-culture usually incorporates. First, an ensemble of values that is at least partially coordinated, ordered, and hierarchized. Second, a set of specified practices and behaviors with which individuals can acquire the ensemble of values. These practices must be comprehensive enough that one can devote one's entire life to them. In ancient times, these practices were referred to as asceticism, a word that then took on a different meaning through Christianity. One widespread exercise, for example, was the examination of conscience. Every evening you should go over the day's events and ask, what did I do? Was it good or bad? Third, a body of knowledge, concepts and theories associated with a set of elaborate techniques. And fourth, a self-culture usually combines a universal call with a strong selection mechanism. Although every school of philosophy had their specific exceptions, the call to change one's life was generally addressed to everyone, whether man or woman, free or slave, rich or poor, highborn or lowborn. Already Pythagoras is said to have admitted women to his school, and there are ancient anecdotes about Stoic and Epicurean slaves. However, it was not universal in the sense of a general ethical law to which every person must submit. In ancient times, self-care was always a free decision in favor of a particular way of life. At the same time, however, the people practicing are only part of a small, exclusive group. The universal appeal is often combined with challenging exercises and a call to change one's life. Moreover, Socrates appealed to many, but was only able to convince a few, and the Stoic philosopher Epictetus is said to have remarked, "Why is 'Know yourself' written over Apollo's shrine, visible to everyone, though no one understands it? Did Socrates persuade everyone who came to him to care for themselves? Not one in 1,000. In early Christianity, too, no one was a priori excluded from salvation. In the event of the apocalypse, however, only a handful of people would be saved. On the one hand, Christianity rejected Greco-Roman self-culture as egocentric. The goal of the early Christians was not the cultivation of the self, but the sacrifice of the self to make room for God. Or as the Apostle Paul wrote, "I no longer live, but Christ lives in me." The early Christians adopted many of the techniques of Roman Greek self-culture, but changed it significantly. In the course of this revolution, the word asceticism changed its meaning and from then on was only associated with renunciation. Furthermore, the techniques that were used quite freely by the Greeks and Romans were systematized and precisely defined. The daily routine in the Christian monasteries was strictly organized, and every exercise had its fixed place. The monastery founders were probably inspired by the organization of Roman military life. The excessive set of monastic rules was precisely recorded in extensive reference works. One of the best known is the Regula Benedicti from the 6th century. Overall, a set of highly sophisticated techniques of self-care, such as the confession, was developed by Christians that had far-reaching effects on the development of the Occident. One of the central aspects of the culture of the self is the relation between the self and truth. Ancient philosophers believed that truth was never something that is simply given to man. A mere act of cognition is not enough. Access to truth requires a transformation of the self through self-practices such as purification, asceticism, and meditation. Foucault referred to this set of self-practices as spirituality. He wrote, "The care of the self designates precisely the set of conditions of spirituality, the set of transformations of the self that are the necessary conditions for having access to the truth." But this transformation was not just an initiation after which one is ready to encounter the truth. It constituted a reciprocal effect. Truth exerted a retroactive effect on the subject. It is this process that enlightens the subject and creates a state of peace of mind. What mattered was not simply the content of knowledge, but the nature of knowledge, that is, how it relates to the subject. In contrast, modern philosophy assumes that knowledge alone is sufficient for the subject's access to truth. Foucault described this shift as the Cartesian moment in the history of truth. From this point onward, the philosopher is thought to gain access to truth solely through the activity of knowing, without any necessary transformation of his being as a subject. There remain certain conditions, such as adherence to formal methods, proper education, impartiality, and scientific consensus, but these conditions are no longer understood as spiritual. They do not require a transformation of the self, but rather the correct application of procedures and standards within the practice of knowledge production. In the second part, I will briefly go through the further history of Western self-culture. In Greco-Roman self-culture, the law was only one of the different forms of self-care. The law was never understood as a universal principle that applies to all men, but as a decision of an individual to follow the way of life of a small group of people. This was probably also true for the earliest Christian communities. In the Middle Ages, however, the law became the principle that governs all human life. There was also a conflict between theology and spirituality that pervaded the Middle Ages. Whereas spirituality, as Foucault understands it, required a transformation of the subject as a condition for access to truth, Christian theology, shaped by its universal claims, contributed to the emergence of a general epistemological subject. The separation of a profound transformation of the subject and access to truth did not occur suddenly with the emergence of modern science. It had been prepared by theology. Another revolution in self-culture occurred during the Renaissance. The Renaissance was an attempt to find alternative ways of living alongside Christian culture by drawing inspiration from antiquity. Yet the goal was not merely to revive an ancient mode of life, but to create something novel. In place of self-denial and neophobia, a new positive form of self-cultivation emerged, in which the virtuoso and the genius took their place alongside the saints and apostles. During the Counter-Reformation of the 16th and 17th centuries, the Catholic Church once again tightened monastic regulations. This renewed ecclesiastical disciplinary apparatus became a model for emerging modern institutions such as general schools, workhouses, and hospitals. At the same time, the nascent human sciences introduced new concepts of the human and developed novel fields of knowledge aimed at shaping and constituting the self. In modern philosophy, beginning with Descartes, the emphasis shifts decisively toward knowledge. Truth is increasingly conceived independently of self-transformation. According to Descartes, to gain true knowledge, it is enough to use your intellect and not be insane. By following a rigorous method, the intellect can be reformed to attain objective knowledge, which is largely decoupled from the moral or ethical transformation of the subject. This period also witnesses the transformation of alchemy, which had historically intertwined knowledge acquisition with self-cultivation, into modern chemistry. In the century following Descartes, the pursuit of scientific truth becomes almost entirely separated from salvation, and knowledge emerges as an autonomous value, capable of fueling limitless progress. Modern science thus rests on a concept of truth oriented toward object knowledge rather than the ethical or spiritual formation of the self. The 18th century is also the age of enlightenment. A key text that illuminates central principles of enlightened self-culture is Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment? In his analysis of this work, Foucault emphasizes its ethical dimension. The exercise of reason is not merely an instrument for acquiring knowledge, but a form of practical engagement. The Renaissance movement that began in the 14th century reached its culmination in the 19th century. Even the gymnastic exercises returned. The so-called hygienist movement began to integrate contemporary knowledge from the human sciences with new forms of self-practice which were voluntarily adopted and cultivated by the emerging middle class. At the same time, disciplinary institutions increasingly structured and regulated the daily lives of citizens within modern states. 19th century German philosophy was deeply concerned with linking the act of knowledge to a transformation of the subject. One of the most prominent examples is probably Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. This may also help explain some of the tensions between this tradition and modern philosophy, which draws on Descartes and Leibniz. Marxists developed a new form of truth that cannot be gained like scientific knowledge. Rather, it is bound to a class consciousness that can be attained by belonging to a specific class and through a transformation of the self. While Marx mainly reduced spirituality, that is, the relationship between self and truth, to class affiliation, Marxist revolutionaries developed their own, specifically communist practices of self-transformation. Moreover, at the turn of the century, the self-technique of psychoanalysis was developed from the Christian confessional technique. Both Marxism and psychoanalysis ask how the subject has to change to gain access to the truth, and how, in turn, the acquisition and articulation of that truth transforms the subject. And after the hygienic movement in the 19th century laid the groundwork, physical training took on a major role in 20th century self-culture. And just as in ancient Rome, the 20th century saw many satires on the excesses of sportsmen, psychoanalysts, and self-help communities. This is only a very brief and superficial outline of the history of Western self-culture. A deeper look would probably bring different insights. Nonetheless, Foucault's lectures proved quite influential. Although his remarks only provided rudiments of an analysis of historical self-cultures, they still serve as an inspiration for many scholars in diverse fields.